It's all about relationships, and that's what we're going to dig into on this module. And not just any type of relationship, Chris. We're going to talk about service relationships, service offerings, all the good stuff. Take us away.
All the good stuff. And one of the things that you're going to find as part of the IT Service Management Framework, known as ITIL 4, is that it's all about services, right? And well, hey, before we talk about the relationship we have, well, what is going to be offered as a part of that relationship? Part of the reason why we have relationships is a provider has something that the consumer needs to create that outcome, right? What is that? How is it made up? Well, that is what a service offering is all about. So let's take a look at this. I got a nice little chart here that talks a little bit about the service offerings, right? And we're going to offer you up service. Now, it can be one service, as we're going to see, or one thing, or it can be a collection of services. A good example of that would be Microsoft's, well, it used to be called Office. Now it's just Microsoft 365, right? But remember, the Office suite had a word processing software, Word. It had spreadsheet software, Excel. It had presentation software. Well, you're kind of watching a little bit of it right now. PowerPoint, right? And so collectively, those things were a service offering. And so that's what we're talking about here. Now, the thing is that it has to be addressed to the needs of the target consumer group. So if you take a look at our options that we can see over here, is that we have goods, access to resources, and service actions. And so let's break these down and then kind of give you a couple of examples of what this might look like. First off, goods are those the components that are transferred to the customer. Ownership is transferred to the customer. The consumer then takes responsibility for the future use, and they give you some examples here: a mobile phone, a physical server, right? Those are being transferred over to you, the customer. So you own those now. They're yours. Now that's different than perhaps the component known as access to resources. Access to resources is going to be something like the license of a software. Because, and I don't know, Scott, have you ever taken the time to read through an end user license agreement, a EULA?
Every one of them, no.
I was going to say,
absolutely.
Wow. I was going to be impressed if you actually did it.
No.
Okay, so if you ever take the time to do this, I did have to do it a couple of times, part of auditing and software and fun things like that. And in there, you're going to find, like for example, Microsoft is a great example. In there, in the end user license agreement that you usually, most people just do the scroll and hit accept, there's going to be a line that says this: this software is the property of Microsoft Incorporated. If at any point in time Microsoft Incorporated requires you to, you must remove said software, from the device that you have it on. Now here's the thing. The reason why they say that is they own the software.
Right.
You don't own the software. A lot of people go, but wait a minute, Chris, I paid for that software. No, you pay for the right to use that software. And that's the way that licensing, in fact, we joke that Microsoft is really a licensing company more than it is a software company, right? It licenses out. And that's true whether it's subscription-based or you actually download the software, that's licensing. And if at any point in time you decide, well, I'm not going to pay for the licensing or I'm not going to pay for that, then you have to remove it. You don't own it, okay? So that's access to resources. Then, of course, they talk about service actions. These are things that are performed by the service provider to address some particular need of the customer. And it's typically going to be according to some sort of agreement that you have. Now, examples like that could be, providing new equipment to you when another piece, so like the warranty aspect of things, transferring of funds from one account to another if you're working with some sort of banking software. There's an action that's provided by that particular software or device or something like that. It could be something where you're moving things from one place to another. So if you hire, some moving company, well, part of that service action is I'm taking your stuff and I'm moving it over there. That's an action that's performed on your behalf.
Right.
Make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Okay. So think about this. And let's build out an example here. Let's say that, I know that you have a propensity to like some good food.
I do like good food.
And I do too, and I'm sure many of you like good food. You know, bad food is not typically things that people like. And you know, he's a foodie guy, so he's taken me on a couple of good places here. And I happen to know that you love the Cubano sandwiches, the Cuban sandwich, right?
I do love a Cuban sandwich.
Okay, so let's say that Scott decides in his spare time, which is a joke, that Scott says, you know, I love food trucks, and I think I want to get into the food truck business. And so he creates Scott's superior Cuban sandwich. And he does some sort of really cool truck, and he's got the whole wrap around it, and he's got his friends from the Columbia restaurant who are helping him out with this. Yeah, very good. Right? See, I remember. Yeah. And they're going to come in and do that. Now, here's the thing. He's got the recipe, you've got the food, you got all that. But the one thing he really needs to be able to do is take money. Now, cash, not a problem, right?
Not a problem.
Yeah, you're like, yeah, bring the cash. Love the cash. But let's say somebody goes, well, do you take debit card or Apple Pay or Google Pay? And he says, oh, right. I
will in a minute.
You will in a minute, because he's going to call a point of sale, a POS company. And that could be, and I'll just use them as an example, because there's a lot. Let's say Square. Right. Okay. I mean, one of the original, right? There's others, Toast, Clover, all those other fun ones out there. And, one of the things that we'll see is that when you call the Square, the rep would say, okay, well, what is it you're trying to do? I have a food truck. I'm going to be selling sandwiches. Okay, well, tell you what, we got basic offerings. We have middle tier offerings, and then we have the whole kit and caboodle ones. And Scott's like, well, I'm just going to start off with the basic package. And she goes, not a problem. In that service offering are going to be goods. The goods are going to be those little squared dongles, right, that you plug into the bottom of your phone or into your iPad or your, tablet, right? The little card readers.
Absolutely.
Now, here's the thing. Those goods, he owns them, right? Because they're not going to ask for them back. Number one, I think they probably cost like a penny a piece or something like that.
They don't want it back.
Yeah, they don't want it back. So he owns those. In fact, I actually have, I think, about a dozen of them in my drawer at home back when I used to do more consulting work, okay? So anyway, because I'd always forget them at home, so I get the new ones. So you have the little dongles. Then the access to resources. So if I'm asking you, Scott, what do you think the access to resources would be?
Their network.
Yeah, their network, the software on your phone. You load the Square software on your phone or on the tablet.
Sure thing.
And then, but again, now here's the thing is, if you decide at some point that you're not going to use Square and you're going to move over to Clover, you don't have access to that anymore, do you?
You're going to terminate my account.
That's right, it's off. Now, how about a service action? Well, we already kind of mentioned it. When I show up, because I trust that these are going to be really good sandwiches.
Very good.
Very good sandwiches. I bring my little debit card, and I swipe my debit card, and there is a transaction that takes place. Square moves money from my account into his account. So see how we have goods, access to resources, and service actions, and that's even in a basic service offering.
It's all around us, right?
Yeah. So we see this in anything that we do. Now, what's interesting is if he wanted to move up to like a medium size, that's where they go, well, how would you like your own device? Not just a little, because he's like, oh, man, I run through these little, I snap them off. Don't you have like your own? Yes, we do. But that's a little bit more. That's a little more money. Medium. And then they even have one where, hey, do you want inventory control software that ties into, now you know how many sandwiches, how much, food? Oh, yeah, a little bit more money, right? But it's all based on, and this is the cool thing, this is all based on the same product offering, right? We would say they're the set of products. So you're going to target these to a service consumer, and in there you're going to be, and by the way, this can be internal as well, and I think this is something very important, and I might have missed this when we talked about a customer. A customer does not necessarily mean somebody outside your organization. In the world of ITIL, even internal employees are customers of the IT department.
Yeah, other departments like operations or the customers or the senior management team or whoever else, they're all customers of the IT organization.
Yeah, so we can see that, okay, well, we're going to be offering these things, and sometimes I'm sure Microsoft, as we like to say, eats its own food, right?
Yeah.
They use Azure and they use Office. Why? Well, because it works, right? Yeah, it doesn't look good when you're going, we're using Gmail for email. Yeah, that wouldn't be good. So what we're saying is that different offerings can be created depending on what the consumer group is looking for. That's why we were saying earlier about Scott and his offering. He's like, hey, the basic is good enough. I just need something to take the money, handle it. I'm good. But other consumer groups are like, yeah, but I don't want to deal with that. Or I just want, and by the way, how do I make sure I order enough, pork and enough bread and enough, all the sauce? And well, having that inventory control system and software, that can also be helpful. But it's all based on a product line that you are going to offer as part of, in this case, to an external company or an external group. And so you have to decide. And now one thing they say is these different offerings, you can see here on the slide, can be based on the same product and used in multiple ways, like we talked about. Well, one example they talk about is when you offer a limited free version of the software. So I'm sure if I looked at your phone, Scott, you've got apps on there, right? Cool apps, awesome apps. Well, here's the dealio. If you download an app, so let's say you download an app and it's free. Mm-hmm. And on it says, oh, by the way, like for example, I was there for a while really for the Instagram and social media, creating posts and creating really cool interactive videos type of stuff. So I got an app that had and advertised these really cool templates. And then I but I got the free one, and I noticed the really cool apps you have to pay for. Here's what happened. I said, you know what? I want those. I'm going to pay it was like $40 for the year, and I had access to all their stuff. Interestingly enough, all I did is say yes, gave them my number. Now here's the question, Scott. Did I have to remove that old app and download the great, cool new update?
Not at all. I bet you they made the functionality magically appear.
Magically appear. Why? Because it's one product, but it's offered in different ways, different service offerings, the limited freeware, and then the fully loaded everything. It's the same thing, just a flip of a switch, or in this case, login or access, we would say, the access to resources, and that's what we have here. Okay, so we did a lot on the service offering, and this is important because the service offering is really what ties the two people together, the two organizations together, and that's where service relationships come in. Service relationship is a cooperation between a provider and a consumer. And the service relationships are going to include, and I know this is going to sound funny, but the provider provides and the consumer
consumes.
There you go. And so what happens is you have to have, what's that thing in the middle? The service offering. It's what is happening between these two organizations. Otherwise, it's maybe, I guess, friendly lunches that the two have together. I'm not sure. You need to have something in common, giving the consumer the outcome, and then they pay for that ability to have that outcome. So what is that? It's that service offering. That's why we talked about it. Now, to create value, an organization must do more, though, than simply create a service offering, slap it out on the table, I take it, and gone, right? The reason why is because there needs to be some sort of relationship, and that means that you need to work on your relationships. And as we're going to see, there's actually a practice called relationship management. Relationship management is all about nurturing these strategic and tactical relationships between you, the provider, and the consumer. Now, that also means the consumer, by the way, because notice it's co-created. This is not just the provider does everything, the consumer just sits there. There has to be give and take. And so what we see here on this slide is kind of an example about how a relationship is produced between the provider and the consumer. But what's really cool is that those providers are going to hand something off to a consumer. You can see that organization A right here. But see what happens with organization B? You know, there's that service relationship, and in that service relationship, A is the provider, B is the consumer. But what is B going to do? Well, B or Bravo is going to take that, whatever they get from Alpha, A, and then turn around, do something with it, and then offer it maybe as a provider to C or Charlie here. So you notice now there's another relationship that is developed, and then Charlie is the consumer, takes that from Bravo, does something, creates something, and their provider, and now Delta or D is going to be the consumer. Why is this important? Why do we want to make sure that as an organization that we have good relationships between the provider and the consumer? Well, let's say, Scott, I'm taking a look, and by the way, this example, this is what they call a service relationship model, and there are many. If you jump into the world of drive stakeholder value, we dive into many different versions of this. This is what they call a linear model. Obviously, A goes to B to C to D, but let's be honest. In fact, I'll kind of show you where this can kind of get crazy with all kinds of people feeding in. But let's say that Alpha and Bravo, A and B here, they get into a little bit of a squabble, a little bit of a snit, and there's a bad relationship between the two of them. What happens to the rest of the model?
In this case, it falls apart.
Yeah.
Right? Because B is dependent on, or C is dependent on B.
Yeah, and D's dependent on C being dependent on B, right? You know, so that you can see this domino, this cascading effect that can happen when there are bad relationships in the, we would say in the world of IT service management. Mm-hmm. And you have probably experienced some of this sometimes. When all of a sudden it's like, well, why is my provider all of a sudden giving me bad service? And you call them up and they're like, we're really sorry. It's not us. We get, X, Y, or Z from this company, and that company has decided that they're going to, up the prices, and we can't pay. So we're looking for a new. All of a sudden, you're affected, right? And so that's why it's important for us as we look at this, just consider this. Now, I told you as we look at this model, how crazy can it get? Well, let's show you. The service relationship model. Every training, they use an example of maybe a training service, right? Well, take a look at this. You've got these suppliers in here. You've got the supplier, that's the internal group, going to the business customers. The business customers are then going to reach out to maybe your students of your training organization, right? Well, guess what? Organization X is going to be providing certain materials in that then, notice the effect. It affects not only your first one, but it affects everybody else. And let's add a couple others into this. And well, now you're starting to have even more relationships that can be affected. And if you don't make sure that you have healthy relationships amongst this group, the ecosystem breaks down. And so that's why ITIL says, hey, look, as a part of the framework, as you implement this, make sure that you work hard on maintaining the provider-consumer relationship. And I know it sounds like, as some says, that's rainbows, lollipops, and unicorns, Chris. That's just not how it works. Well, why? Why can't it? As organizations, as companies, if we commit to using something like a framework like ITIL, this can happen. And then everybody wins, as I like to say. It's not like, just these companies. No, everybody wins in a situation like this.
Beautiful. Okay,
so let's talk real briefly about, first off, the difference between provision and consumption. Here's the good news. From an ITIL 4 foundation exam perspective, just understand in service provision, these are any activities done by the, surprise, service provider. And that means they maintain their equipment. They make sure they give access. They grant the access to the users. They fulfill any of the agreed service actions. They do what they need to do to provide to the consumer. So that's provision. That's the activities, the work that happens. That could be anything from delivering the goods. It could be turning the lights on, flipping the lights on and getting things going. It could be anything. But whatever it is, that is done by the provider. Those are things we do as a service provider if we're the provider. Consumers, of course, are any activities performed by the service consumer. Well, what's that? Well, I make sure, for a good example of this, we're talking about apps, right? If I'm not updating in my case, an iPhone to the correct iOS, eventually the new apps aren't going to work on my phone. Well, whose responsibility is that? Well, if Scott here is, good friends with Tim Cook over at Apple, and I say, hey, my apps aren't working. Well, it's not like Tim's going to say, hey, Scott, go down to Chris's house and update his iOS for him. That's not going to happen. That's my responsibility as a consumer. I need to make sure I maintain my gear. I need to make sure I have the ability to access. If I'm not connected to the internet, it's kind of hard to use web services, isn't it? So it's kind of like one of those things where you're like, well, we need to be able to do our stuff on our end as consumers in order to accept and receive that which is being provided. And what is that thing in the middle? The service offering. And one last thing is you might see in a small lit room this thing called service relationship management. The key magic word there is when you do joint activities. These are things where we work together. A good example of this would be things like cybersecurity, because both provider and consumer typically work together. Like I'm a provider and I say, hey, Scott, let's help secure. Let's do multi-factor authentication, MFA, right? And now here's the thing is I can do my end, but Scott has to do his part too. Together, we need to do this. Make sense?
That makes sense to me.
Okay, so that's part of that service relationship management where together we get together, we would say, and we create these relationships where, hey, co-creation of value, I'm going to do something, you're going to do something, we're going to do it together, joint activities to maintain the value co-creation that we're looking for.
All right, thank you, Chris. And you know what? We get to move into one of my favorite parts of ITIL next, which is the guiding principles. So I can't wait to see you there.